this, you'll simply have to leave. So do we want to stay over? All right, I got it. All right. Of the things that I look back and I think where I hopefully succeeded with the congregation, places where maybe I could have done more, should have done more. And people who have gone through conversion with me know I'm always saying, listen, you're going to study with me, that's great. Go somewhere else. Go make sure you're going to other synagogues, learn from other rabbis, because I am not the only rabbi, like not even close, obviously. And I think over the last 6 months, the congregation has been exposed to more rabbis than in normal on account of the rabbinic search, right? So the people, in particular, if you're on the search committee, really saw more of my colleagues and what's out there. And it's so important to remember there are various voices in the rabbinic world, certainly within our movements of Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, but even across town or across parts of the state. And I think that's really important. And so that we've had, and then I went and married a rabbi, so that brought more to it. And we, whether it's Rabbi Josh last night, we as rabbis, we get influences from different places too. So there may be things, oh, it's great, Rabbi Mark taught this or brought this, yeah, but I'm probably getting that more than likely from my teachers and those who are around. It's the same in any of your fields, right? You go and you become a product of what's around. And so I'm very grateful, Amy, that you agreed to teach this morning. Some of you got to meet her through her teaching, talking about the Shabbat brachot. And so today we're looking at that section, as I mentioned last night, this part of the Seder, for those who are still awake at that time in the evening, when we get to Shvo Chamatcha, this part with the Kosiliah. So with that, you've got handouts in front of you. Folks online, we're going to, there was the sort sheet, if you had a chance to download it ahead of time. I'm also going, does everyone have it in front of them, by the way? Because if so, if not, I'm going to put it up on the screen. So don't worry, if you don't have it, I'm going to do a share screen. For us here in the room, I'm going to make it really small so that we can still see everyone's opponents up there. That's why. So you've got the hard copy. Don't okay. And just everyone remember that the mic is pretty sensitive and will pick us up, but we got to make sure that we're loud enough. We're there, and everyone who's at home, I am going to be monitoring the chat also. So if you have a question or something's not clear, you can drop it in the chat, and I'll be paying attention to that as well. So, Rabbi Amy Wallk.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I want to tell a few stories and explain how I chose this topic to look at this morning. And I'm going to start by saying my shul has a minyan every morning and every evening. And there's a woman who's been coming to our minyan now for a couple of months. And she is she spent her adult life in a Reform congregation. She sang Kaddish for her mother, so she's with us. And she said to me, can't we, like every morning, is there something we can say for the situation in Ukraine? And I heard her and I said, yeah, but no. I mean, like our minyan is a half hour. And if I start adding extra kavanot, then all of a sudden extra teachings, it's going to be 45 minutes, and like we have to be done. So I said, but there's lots of liturgy that when I'm davening, I'm very clearly thinking about what's going on in Ukraine. And of course, I know the liturgy, Patty doesn't. So she said, well, like, what's an example? So I said to her, so for example, in the morning Amidah, there's a blessing that says, in Hebrew, it's the Ramashim Alti Tikva Bakol Hirshak Kirega Toved. Frustrate the hopes of all who malign us. Let all evil very soon disappear. Let all your enemies soon be destroyed. May you quickly uproot, crush the arrogant. May you subdue and humble them in our time. Praise are you, Lord, who humbles the arrogant. I said, I hope, like, as I'm saying that, and at different times of life, I think of different characters. And I'm actually clear not to think of somebody who irritated me or sent me an annoying email. Like that's not talking about a nudnik, that's talking about God's enemy. And there's a difference, right? And so I said, so that's an example. And so, Patty didn't know that blessing. And then the other example, I just reminded her, there's a series of there's a concluding blessing. Psalm 20 reads out by saying, a psalm of David, may the Lord answer you in time of trouble. May the God of Jacob be your strength. May he send you help from his sanctuary, sustaining you from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and accept your sacrifices, granting your heart's desires, fulfilling your hopes. When we do David, as the sound goes on and says God will answer from his heavenly abode, bringing victory with mighty deeds, I do think of, those are the two places in the morning liturgy that come to my mind. As Patty and I were talking some more, she said, I don't know either of those prayers. And I was reminded that Patty she grew up at my shul, and then she crossed the street and she went to the Reform shul. She's a serious Reformer. I want to say, like, she goes all the time. She's very committed, but it's not in her liturgy. And then your rabbi here and I were talking, and I said, I'd like to teach Wallk, and he said, remember what he said? I don't really like that.
We're going to talk a little later, but what I would substitute. Go ahead.
I said it's one of my favorite things to say at the Seder. I love it. He debated the Kiddushim, but thank God he didn't go too far back in the reflection. But then I thought to myself, someone I love and admire and respect says he doesn't like it so much, and I love it. So I gotta chew on that a little bit. I'm gonna stick with I really like it. I do, but actually what I want to do is explain it and teach it and look at the text. So that's the first thing. That's story number one, getting us into it. Story number two is I grew up in a house where my mom and dad probably had 20, 25 people at Seder all the time. And if you knew my father, he was a dermatologist. He was not a public speaker. He didn't like leading a Seder. For him, when we were kids growing up, if Seder started at 7, at about 6:45, we'd pull out the Seder and say, so when I turned 13 or 14, he was so excited that I could lead the Seder. He could have done it. He loved his Judaism. He didn't love leading the Seder. Like, that just wasn't his voice. Okay. So I led the Seder at my parents' house for years and years and years. And we always had Jews and non-Jews at the Seder. And we would go around the table reading. And we had for many years, we had that red and yellow Haggadah. And then we had the conservative movement standard Haggadah. And if your Hebrew was good enough, yeah, that's the one. I grew up with that. If your Hebrew was good enough, you could read from the Hebrew, but most people, only a handful of people could do that. Most people read from the English. So there was my aunt Pat, who, when we got to Rabbi Yossi, he said Jose, she said Rabbi Jose. Like, these jokes, right? And somebody else would say B'nai Brak, and somebody, whoever was reading would say Benny Barak. And like, this became the lore of the Wallk family Seder. You might see some of that this year. I just don't know. I don't know if enough people are going to be there to remember those jokes, but in any case, so just imagine this 13-year-old kid reading the Seder, and I can't believe,
Who's the youngest of 4, by the way.
Yes, the youngest of 4, and there I am going around and reading. So at our Seder, there were my dad had a nurse. Mrs. Niebuhr was her name. Mrs. Niebuhr was from Dresden, Germany, and she and Mr. Niebuhr were really like 5th and 6th grandparents to us. I just love them very, very much. She was like there's a piece of art in our house, in my house, in our house, that Mark was looking at, and I was like, oh, that's sacred, right? And I was telling him how Mr. Niebuhr painted, like very, very, very special people. We would go to their house the day after Christmas. I learned how to decorate a Christmas tree with Mrs. Niebuhr. I'm particular. I'm a good Christmas tree decorator. I don't know if you knew that, but I know from tinsel, like Mrs. Niebuhr taught me. So we're going around the room. And we get to Mr. Niebuhr. It's like, Mr. Niebuhr, will you read on the top of page, whatever page it was? So Mr. Niebuhr goes, pour out your wrath on the nations that do not know you, upon the kingdoms that do not invoke your name, for they have devoured Jacob and desolated his home. Pour out your wrath on them. May your blazing anger overtake them. Pursue them in wrath and destroy them under the heavens of Adonai. So you got to know, Mr. and Mrs. Niebuhr were born in Germany. This was the 1970s. I didn't even know what I was doing. Like, you know what? Like, do you think I had no clue what I was doing? And Mr. Niebuhr looked at me to like, what's that mean? I said, well, it's in the Seder. I don't know. I mean, I don't even think I understood those words when I was 13 years old. Like, he just read it. He didn't know. And there was like a noticeable discomfort at the Seder table. But, you know, like we were family, and I mean, we were very close. And I think someone said something like, look at Jews and their enemies. And that's a remnant of. And we laughed and we sang and the Seder concluded. Fast forward now, I'm 22 years old and I'm still leading this family Seder. And this time at the family Seder, Mr. Markwell, my high school history teacher, was probably one of the reasons I decided to become a rabbi. He's at the Seder. And I asked, again, well, the mistakes, I asked Mr. Markwell to read that. Again, not like, who remembers what I did with Mr. Niebuhr when Mr. Markwell comes along? Only Mr. Markwell, when he reads it, it's like, well, of course this is in your Seder. You've had enemies, you Jewish people have had enemies throughout the ages. I'm honored that you allowed me, and he turned this into like this, he turned this into a sermon about what a wonderful thing it was that we were close enough that I could ask him. And he was a very, very special man. But that, like that point at 22, I was like, oh, I got, you know, I realized I got to understand this piece. So this piece of the Seder has sort of been an important part to me for many years for different reasons. And I do actually say it is one of my favorite parts of the Seder. It really is. And it comes in a part where Elijah, right? We have the meal, and my childhood family always we did go back after the meal for the Birkat HaMazon, for Elijah's cup, and for some singing. This is not as in my community, not a tzitzis check. Like, I'm not checking your observance level when I say, how many of you go back after the meal? Because I know most people don't. I really know that. But how many of you have opened the door for Elijah? So I want to say to you, here's what's interesting. If I were teaching you 100 years ago, which would of course not be possible, but if I were teaching you, no, I mean, because there weren't women rabbis 100 years ago, right? But if I were teaching a room full of folk 100 years ago, and I asked how many of you opened the door for Elijah, many of you would not have raised your hand. It's an interesting thing, and especially many of you from a Reform background would not have raised your hand, because what is Elijah? What's Elijah symbolize for us? Hope and redemption, but in particular, Ellen, looks like you're raising your hand. Were you?
No, that's
Yes, and when Elijah is talking about a Messiah, he's not talking about a messianic era. You all in the liturgy that in the Reform movement, it's Umevi Geulah, right? Right. You all saying Umevi Geulah, you bring redemption, whereas in the more traditional liturgy, and I'm not saying, oh, I believe this and I don't believe that. I actually want to say the ideas of the Reform movement about a redemptive era make a whole lot more sense to me. It's actually what I believe. It's just my liturgy says, Umevi Goel, God, you bring a redeemer. And I just want to say, as we talk about the Messiah, a former rabbi who grew up in my congregation, he's already a retired rabbi, so I certainly have no credit for his wisdom in Torah. He wrote, I think, one of the best books about the topic, which is There Is No Messiah and You Are It. Right? That's Rabbi Robert Green, right? And so that's the teaching. So all this is background that I want us to talk about Shvo Chamarcha, and it comes after the Birkat HaMazon. Depending upon the Haggadah, very often there is the opening of the door, there is the singing of Eliyahu, and then there's Shvo Chamarcha. And the people are standing for this whole 3 minute, 4 minute, however long it is. So we don't have to stand, but we should sing. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, B'meira b'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David. So here's what we're going to do. Those are those verses, okay? Imagine for Mr. Niebuhr, pour out your wrath on the nations that do not know you, on the kingdoms that do not invoke your name, for they have devoured Jacob and desolated his home. Pour out your wrath on them, may your blazing overtake them, pursue them in wrath and destroy them under the heavens of Adonai. So first of all, these three verses were chosen from all of Tanakh. And Mark Brettler, who's a professor of Bible studies at Brandeis University, he just gives us a little background about all three of these verses. The first verse, Psalm 79, verses 6 and 7. The psalm is most likely written in response to the destruction of the first temple, as indicated by the first verse of the psalm. O God, heathens have entered your domain, defiled your holy temple, and turned Jerusalem into ruins. Okay, the first temple was destroyed. You could imagine that that would be the response. The second verse, Shoch Alehem, Zamecha B'charon Avcha Yisugim. This verse refers to unnamed enemies, though later in the psalm talks about being delivered again. So we assume that this also refers to the destruction of the first temple. And it's kind of nice that the Shvoch is there in both instances. And then from Lamentations, and does anybody know when we read Eicha? We read Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, right? And Tisha B'Av is when we commemorate the destruction of the second temple, but the truth is our sages telescope all tragedy onto Tisha B'Av. The destruction of the first temple, the second temple, the expulsion from Spain, the Crusades, it's all there from Lamentations. It's chosen because it continues that theme of wrath and destruction. So you have these verses that made it into our Haggadah, and a certain question to ask is, well, when did they get there? And so I want to say that the scholars are pretty sure these didn't get into the Haggadah until sometime around the Crusades. I didn't know then the first 1,000 years, they did not make it in. So when Mark and I were talking about why I like this piece so much, this was one of the commentaries that when I first read it, I just thought it was brilliant, right? And it stuck with me. So I don't always like to read, but I don't know who likes to read. So if there's, I don't know, is there someone who would be comfortable reading Rabbi Danny Landy's commentary, which is on page 2 at the top of the page?
Steve?
Okay.
We'll work our way over there, Bob. You're not there if you want.
The doors open, the fourth cup is poured, and we recite this while standing and while holding a wine cup, so as to fulfill the verses of Kohelet. A time is set for every experience under heaven, a time to love and a time to hate. Hatred, even when justified, is of such power that it must be controlled and contextualized. It is controlled in that its sole home expression in Judaism is here in the Seder, limited to only a few short, albeit vivid lines, and the vengeance is turned over to God. It comes while we open our doors. This is Leil Shimurim, the night of watching. After all, on it we own the anger that we have repressed throughout the years during hostilities. At this point, having gone through slavery and freedom, we achieve the clarity to identify our enemies who claim to believe in God, but attempt to destroy his people.
So Landy's, I'm gonna call him Danny because he went to high school with my brother. So like if I call him Danny, it's not an insult, all right? I just, okay, Landy's so names it, there's a time to hate. And I actually really appreciate that. That doesn't mean that you let your life could be consumed by hate. But there's a time to express hatred. And there's a reasonable moment to say, I can't stand it. And then the best husband ever. I'm anticipating I was getting finished. There's always a time to love. Now, here though, what he says is, first of all, I love the idea. This is the only moment in your whole home ritual that you're allowed to express a little bit of hate. You don't get to do it every Tuesday and Friday or Monday and Thursday. No, and then he says it's controlled and contextualized. Okay, so let's go back to the verses of text for a second. How is it controlled? Because I actually think there's a lot of brilliance in these 3 sentences, which if we were to look at the other 2 pieces of liturgy I brought in from the Amidah and the Psalm, they're there as well. So I'm using this as an example because 3 weeks from today is Passover and you should have something to talk about. But so look at it. When the text says, pour out your wrath on the nations that do not know you. upon the kingdoms that did not invoke your name. Look at what the text is saying. It is not saying, pour out your wrath on the people who make me angry, or pour out your wrath on the people who impose taxes on me. It's not actually about me. Who's the enemy here?
Those who offend God.
Yeah, it's not about me. Right, I mean, the truth of the matter is, what Mr. Markwell, my history teacher, knew is that he was not an enemy of God. Pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you. Mr. Markwell went to church every Sunday. He knew God. Mr. Niebuhr was a painter and not as knowledgeable. You know, he wasn't intellectual, he was an artist, quite frankly. Not that an artist can't be an intellectual. So when he read it, he was just stymied, like, what does this say? Right? Mr. Markwell, who was a PhD in history and taught history, he read this and said, this isn't talking about me. I'm so glad that you invited me to teach this, because this isn't about me, because I'm not an enemy of God. Right? The text is really clear. And this is when Landy says it is contextualized and it is contained. It doesn't, you don't get to express your hate. I'm going to tell you how you can express your hate. I'm going to give you the language, because you actually, I don't really trust you. And quite frankly, quite wisely so. Because I could just imagine the wrong person turning around and saying, kill all the, right, especially like, kill all those Germans. I could understand that if I had been through, I could see it, but this is the, no. Pour out your wrath on those who do not know you. And by the way, who's going to be pouring out the wrath? God. All you get to do is be angry and express it. You don't actually get to express it to God. You don't actually get to express the hate to God's enemies. You just sit back and say, would you please? And that's a very different kind of expression, right? Right. So the historical piece is, and all through this, pour your wrath on them, may your blazing anger overtake them. That's very different than, let me get my hands on them, I'm gonna kill them.
Don't grab your guns.
Right, let me go get my gun and take care of them. I'm gonna take, like, no, that's not it at all. And the truth of the matter is, I thought about Shloch HaMachaz to a certain extent when I see looting, and when I see really, when I see minority groups that have been victimized become violent, I think they need Shloch HaMachaz. Because Shloch HaMachaz is, and the words Landy's used are so important, contained and contextualized. And it's a very powerful and important piece that he adds to us. And he just says, like, how is it possible that the Jewish people could possibly, given our 2,000 years of history from the destruction of the Second Temple, we better not forget all that. We better not forget that we have enemies. We just need to find a way to hold on to that and keep it in perspective. Questions about this? And please, you don't know me so well, so you might think I don't like to be interrupted. I like to be interrupted. So if you have a question or a comment, share it. That makes it much more interesting. Please. One minute.
Debbie, go ahead.
I'm ignorant about this, but does the Torah ever capitalize you? Because you could be taken different ways. And
so remember, there are no, it's a great question. There's just nothing, because I'm actually, when I was typing this, I was trying to be very careful to capitalize the Y so that when in as many moments as possible, so that we would know that Y is you, God. But remember, Hebrew, and this is why I should have been Israeli, because I'm the world's worst speller and editor. You know that. Really bad, really, really bad. It's a miracle that Mark puts up with that sometimes, but that's another story. You don't have to worry about capitals in Hebrew. That's just the most beautiful thing. You do have to worry about a mem sofit and a pei sofit and a nun sofit, like 3 letters are final. That's sofit.
Savi.
Oh, sorry. Oh, right, I forgot. Okay, fine.
No, man.
Okay, but I would know it. I would know that. You are
Bad spelling.
About them in Israeli.
It's okay.
We love you, Naomi. We're so
Just say it like back it is.
I own it, I own it. So to answer your question, thank God, Hebrew does not have capitals. So English does, and when you see a capital Y, it was me saying that versus clearly talking about you up there as opposed to you over here. It's a great question. There's no ignorance about that at all.
But is it, if I just want, it's so interesting if you think about the nature of where those citations come from Lamentations or from Psalms. It is the psalmist writing who is effectively saying, God, do this,
Right.
guard your wrath, as opposed to coming from the book of Deuteronomy, where we're remembering Amalek, who's the representation of evil, that it says, remember, don't forget, erase the name of Amalek. It doesn't say, go obliterate them. Okay, maybe for idolatry it's going to, isn't it? Yeah, thank you for catching me before I might put one any further down the throat.
But the rabbis don't choose that
But the
word.
rabbis don't
actually.
choose that word.
The rabbis intentionally choose verses that turn to God and that don't turn to people.
Right.
Seth, you have a
That's-
question?
yeah.
In the English, fury, wrath, and anger.
Mhm.
And in the Hebrew, you've got three different expressions, two of which are translated as wrath. What is the difference in the Hebrew?
Mm. It's Chama, Zaham, and Charon. Yeah, those are all nuances of anger. What would you do with Zaham, Naomi? Charon is that's the expression of when God flares his nostrils. That's Charon off. And then Chama is like the heat, the passion and blood. And then what was the last one was
Tashmi game?
Tashmi Dave is obliterated or destroyed.
Then
Yeah.
Ba'af.
Ba'af, Tirdof Ba'af, pursue, well, how would you do Ba'af with your nose? Like sniff, I really sniff them out. Go sniff them out and find them and eradicate them, annihilate.
So the pursue with wrath is interpretive translation.
It's interpretive and it's sticking with what's been going on in the last two
Right.
verses. But it's sniff it out, smell it, go pursue it and really investigate, which is interesting too. Like, don't just wantonly go out, forget I'm angry, I'm gonna go loot and destroy any store that's in the neighborhood. No, like that idea of land experience is so contextualized. It's such an important word there. Was there a comment, Steve Mizell? I see. Just make sure you unmute first.
So one of the things I'm a little confused about with this part is that if memory serves me, and I might be wrong, God brought the destruction of the temple on because of the behavior of the people, and Jeremiah railed against the behavior of the people. So we're asking the source of the result to now be angry at somebody else that he used to do this.
Okay, so it's a really good question. It's a really great question. So I want to remind you, this didn't make its way into the Haggadah for 1,000 years later. And by 1,000 years later, the editors of the Haggadah are now using traditional liturgy to express pain and anger. And they're using verses in a different kind of way, but I'm also going to say that even now, so that's one piece, is they're using traditional liturgy in a different kind of way. But the second thing I'm going to say is, when the Psalms were written, or when Lamentations was written, it was the rabbis who took that story and said, you brought this on yourself. The rabbis wanted us to see this as, what could we have done to stop the destruction of the first or the second temple? At the time, there were plenty of people who saw the Babylonians as the enemy. Right? Are you following me? So, and the most important piece I think to say is that what happens here is, and this is what we do, which is we take these verses from the Tanakh, or it was the editors of the Haggadah took these verses of from the Tanakh that they thought would be applicable to this moment of we have real enemies. We are gonna hold on to this anger and hate, but we're going to express it in a way that is within our, that works within our tradition. And I just need to take a moment and remind you, most people didn't have a Haggadah in 1,000 years ago. Remember, the word Seder means order. There was an order to a Seder. There was a mnemonic that where you sang Kadesh, right? You sing it. That's how you knew what to do. The idea of sitting around a table reading something is a whole new idea, right? That's new meaning since the printing press. And so what happened was when you got to the Birkat Hamazon, Barech was like, okay, so that's when we might do something about Elijah. And somebody brought this in and somehow it was so brilliantly accepted. There it is. And it became a part of it. And now it's printed in Haggadah. But it took a while before it got in. And I'm going to say, I think it stuck because it speaks to the soul of what many a Jew experienced throughout history. Can we go on? Any other questions?
I
Okay.
just want to play for a second that idea, because what's gonna follow is Hallel, right?
Yeah, well, Hallel starts a little before too.
I know, but so I'm just wondering, like, we're gonna praise God, let's just take a minute. I think about the Crusades, right? There's
Right.
obviously so much anger among the Jews living, understandably, and hurt, pain, loss, to drop it, that they drop it in there.
Right.
Just
Right, totally interesting. And just, you know, because of the Holocaust, we stopped really thinking about the pain of the Crusades or of the Chamitzki pogrom or of the expulsion in 1490. I mean, the Holocaust just makes it all look like, oh, that wasn't a big deal. Well, those were horrific, right? Like, let us not forget that. I have a Haggadah that we use, which just shows every time Jews were expelled or persecuted. I once taught a class, this man Ed, he was a great student. He said to me, Rabbi, I really like this class, but it feels to me like the Jews are always being persecuted, expelled, or killed. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a lot of European history. And so this, no surprise, Shlomo Hamacha gets in that point. So Landis talks about the halachic piece there, and he talks about contextualized control, the time to love, the time to hate. My teacher, Professor Neil Gilman, who was on faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he talked about theology. And again, he's writing about this, and he says, again, a disturbing passage that some versions of the Haggadah choose to omit. These verses express the Jewish people's collective sense of vindictiveness toward its enemies in all generations. Some Jews prefer to view God as gentle and compassionate and find his prayer inappropriate. Other Jews have personally experienced the hostility of other nations and find no difficulty in reciting it. But if we put these words into their ritual context in the Seder itself, they acquire a different tone. It's customary for us to stand at these verses, as these verses are recited, open the door of our home and pour a cup of wine to welcome Elijah into our homes. So just think about that ritual. You stand, and look, I want to say, like, when I was a child, we didn't stand. But somewhere I learned that you should stand, and I love the idea we all stand. Somebody opens the door. You sing Eliyahu and you do Shvok Hamakam. Like in my childhood, Mr. Nebo was sitting down, Mr. Markle was sitting down. Nobody opened the door, there was no movement. So here Gilman's already telling us what a tradition would look like. And he says, what's it supposed to signify? So he offers us this answer. First, following something in the book of Malachi, Elijah's role in the Jewish tradition is to herald the coming of the Messiah. More generally, Elijah is the personalization of redemption because he never really died. According to 2 Kings, Elijah was taken up to heaven in a fairy chariot. He is the ultimate liminal personality who has mastered the threshold between life and death. As such, he returns to earth at various liminal moments. At every circumcision ritual, for example, at the Havdalah ritual, the close of Shabbat, and the climax of the Passover Seder. So let's pause for a moment. What is liminal? It's kind of transition, right? If I were an architect, I would say that's the liminal moment. You're not in this room and you're not out of it, right? Right, that's liminal. It's a moment of transition. So now I want to ask you, why is Shabbat and a bris and Seder, why are those liminal moments?
It's a demarcation between the bris is between.
I mean,
Between-
right, coming into the covenant,
Yeah.
right? Right? And so there's this notion of, and newborn babies are, as you well know, historically, newborn babies, there's a fragility to them, right? And now we take it for granted that most of the time a baby is born and is gonna be healthy and all will be well.
That is, it's true, it's true, 99.9%.
But
A neonatologist.
Well, but when it doesn't happen, man, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't 99.99%
No,
100
no,
years ago,
Yeah,
or 200, so that's a piece.
Or even 100 years ago.
Right, for sure.
and still to this day, advanced service.
But so that's one piece, is to just talk about that. And so Elijah's there to help this child go into the covenant and to be saved. When the week ends and the new begins, it's a transition, right? You're vulnerable. Transitions are vulnerable times. And I just need to say, I just think about this. I'm gonna personalize this for a second. Transitions are really hard, right? For Mark right now, he's not here, he's not there. It's a very difficult time, right? When a couple is engaged and they're not yet married, there's a certain it's hard, right? And I say that it's exciting and all that sort of stuff, but you're not in my congregation, I would say you're not milchik and you're not fleshik, right? You're not there. And the moments of transition are complicated and difficult. Right, exactly right. And you said it better than I would. So Gilman is saying that Elijah's there in these moments, and if Elijah's there, here we are saying, pour out your wrath. So now let me ask you, before we go on, why would it make sense to read Shvok HaMakan with Elijah?
It's to help with the transition be saved, basically.
Right?
Okay. Request.
Okay, so think about it. You've ever sent a child to college, you've ever sent a child to live in an apartment, whatever it is, like when you're as somebody who you love is taking a next step and they're in transition, what's in your heart and what's in your prayer for them? What are you thinking and saying? We want them to be safe, right? Right? And if anybody, so my youngest just went to college, right? And she is a mommy's girl, totally. And she goes to college and there's this, right? I think to myself, if anybody tries to hurt them, I want to kill. They bet, right? I just this. Right, exactly right. But I know it's not me, so they won't come up, right? Like in other words, I really and I say that when anybody, especially I want to say, I specifically said children or grandchildren because I think there's this protectiveness of vulnerability where, others, I think they could take care of themselves. So I'm not as worried and I don't have this so here, Gilman is saying, Shvok HaMakan comes out in this moment of vulnerability in the Seder, right? So that's why it's there.
I think there may be another level to it, which is that Eliyahu represents an age of peace. And what is happening here is it's not pure destructive, being vindictive and get rid of those people. It's deal with this now as a preparation for a time when we won't have the people attacking us, so we won't have the destruction.
I'll buy it. I'll buy it. So someone, Larry and Gale said, so in the Maxwell Haggadah, it says, pour out your wrath on the heathen. So it's a translation, and as you can see, there are better translators to me on the right and on the left. I don't translate. I just want to say that it's just not my thing. My mind isn't that nitty gritty specific, so I'm the wrong one to ask, except I'm going to say the Maxwell translation, I will authoritatively say, is probably not the most scholarly translation.
You see that because it seems to indicate pour it out on the person, not the nation.
So,
Based on that translation of the heathen.
right, so, but here it says, El HaGoyim Asher Lo Yada'u. I mean, it's pretty clear, it's the nations.
It's the
Nations,
Nations,
specifically
plural.
that did not.
I know you.
Right,
Not
not
just any nation.
No, exactly.
Yes.
And the truth is, the commentary is, what does it mean not to know you? Mr. Markwell, he knew God And he just knew that I would never ask him to read something that said, you don't know God. He knew that when it talked about the nations that don't know God, it meant the bad guys, not the non-Jews. He just intuitively knew that. So let's go on. So Gilman goes on, he says, Elijah's appearance in our homes at this moment celebrates our achievement of redemption. We understand at the same time that redemption is not complete. The world is not yet redeemed. We remind ourselves of that unfinished work by opening the door and looking out into the world at large. Part of that unfinished work is the hostility of the nations toward the people of Israel. It's on these nations that we ask God to pour out your wrath, not indiscriminately, but on those nations that have opposed Israel's redemptive vision of a just and charitable world. So what does Gilman add? Look, we all know we've been redeemed. I have the most charmed life. Right? On a good day, I wake up, and like most of the time I wake up and I sit there and I think I'm the luckiest person in the world to be a rabbi. Right? Lucky me to be a woman in the 21st, to have been born at the end of the 20th century, middle of the 20th century. Wait. How lucky am I? I could have been born in Poland in the 17th century. I could have been born in England in the 10th century. Like I am just lucky and charmed, and I live redemption every day. I know it, right? I do know that. And Gilman is saying we all do actually. Remember, Gilman he's writing. Gilman was my teacher, so he was writing in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And he's saying, as you sing Eliyahu Hanavi, you can celebrate redemption, and you open the door and you remind yourself the world is not fully redeemed. And you say Shlomo Kamacha, not necessarily for yourself, Gilman says, but you say it because you know that there is some places where redemption has not been experienced. That's also an interesting, but he's not taking it out. Questions or comments to where we are so far? Because now the next thing I want to do is take us through a little bit of a historical look at some Haggadot. And one question I want to ask is, what is my end time? Did you say 3, 4 in the afternoon?
About that, yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, we can do a seduction sheet and then close off the day together. So normally I try to finish teaching by 11:15, 11:20, and so we finish about 11:30.
Okay, great.
But people are very kind. As always, if anybody needs to leave at any time, you are allowed. There's no, the doors do open upon trying to depart. So, or just close on that. That's all right. Do not take this.
Yes.
There was a comment. You go to me. I'm
So
Jeff.
Jeff, I still keep thinking of Abraham's plea to God to save life, not to annihilate it. Yeah, that's this very pure notion of the Bible. And this comes from the experience of living. What I want to say is this reflects the heart of the Jewish people. Shmuel Hamachaz says, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of the persecution and the expulsion and the fleeing. This made its way into the Haggadah after the Crusades. So it's a very powerful time.
In the same way that your church-going history teacher was not one of the other. Many Jews were of the other who were idol worshipers, in some of the books of prophets. And there was destruction brought upon them because of the same reason. So it's not a religious centric thing.
Although I think that when it made it into the Haggadah initially, I think it was about those goyim, and I don't use that word. Like I say it there, like right. I think that's how it got in after the Crusades, because it was us and them. I mean, that was the way the world, and that was a perfect comment. So understanding historically how it came in. Now we're going to the Union Haggadah of 1907. So Carol Balin, I believe is how she pronounced her last name, is a professor at Hebrew Union College, and she did an analysis of the history of various non-Orthodox, or well, I could say liberal, but I don't mean politically, I mean religiously liberal. I want to be clear about that. And the truth of the matter is there are thousands and thousands of Haggadot, you know that. So we're only looking at some that are the product of the Reform, the Conservative, and the Reconstruction movement, because that's sort of an ideological piece. And as Seth was trying, reasonably sort of say, how am I gonna make sense for this for me, and say, oh, those people who don't know you. I mean, quite frankly, I could see that being used in some not nice ways if we went with your interpretation. I could imagine some ultra orthodox sort of saying that I don't know God, or our community turning around and saying they're a bunch of fools and they don't know God. But I really do think in its intent, it was us, the Jewish people, them, the people who hurt us, and whoever picked these verses saying, we're going to give you a language that is appropriate, that is contextualized. So here's what she says. Carol Balin says, in the Union Haggadah from 1907, Shvok is absent, and Elijah is relegated to an explanatory appendix where he's described as a popular folk hero. So it's obvious why Shvok isn't in the Union Haggadah of 1907. I say it's obvious, but in case it needs explanation, what's going on in the Reform world in 1900? What? Yes. And there was a strong, you just jump in and correct me if I don't say it properly, because I know about conservative, but there was a strong emphasis on universalism. And the notion was, with the emancipation and the Enlightenment, we were citizens of the world. And the last thing we wanted to do is emphasize differences between us. So Shvok HaMachad, there would be no place for it, because there was this idealism. We can look back and say this naive idealism, but hindsight's 2020. There was this idealism that the world, we weren't going to have enemies, and I mean, the world.
We're
would
going to
turn a
unite
corner.
them. This is just 20 years after the creation of what's the famous, the Pittsburgh Platform of a group of rabbis who come up. One of the statements is this kind of the brotherhood of humanity, that we will all be together, and the nations of justice, and that kind of language. And so Elijah's, that we don't need to worry so much, and Shvok, it's just not appropriate. Why would you use that kind of language? It doesn't belong.
So that's 1907. Do you have a Haggadah in 1907?
I probably from the 23.
Okay.
Want me to go grab it?
No. In 23, look what it says. Maybe we'll use it for the same. It's 1923 revision interprets Hallel with the instruction. And this is all before the meal, because I just think the assumption was is that people wouldn't come back. The door is open for Elijah. It remains open for the reading of Psalm 117, after which the door is closed. While there is no commentary explaining the opening of the door for the prophet in this newer edition, the reintroduction of welcoming Elijah bespeaks his powerful hold on the popular imagination. I want to stop here. It's kind of like in the Reform liturgy, at one point, Kol Nidre was taken out. Okay?
About the same era, by the way.
Right, but the people were going to have none of that. A similar one is if you want to really ask good questions at the Seder, the 4 questions are not the ones to ask. But you go and tell Bubby and Zadie that you go and run a religious school where you don't teach the 4 children, and see how long you keep that, and where you don't teach the 4 questions. Like, we're gonna sing, even though they're bad questions, we're gonna sing them because it's got a place in the folk, place in the people, right? And that's what they're saying about Elijah.
And I just want to say that just as when it says here in 23 that they introduced, but all they basically just say the door's open for Elijah, because people were still doing it, right? So with Kol Nidre, it was the same thing. What they did is that all they put in were the 2 words Kol Nidre. They didn't put the prayer. That it was there because congregations like, what are you kidding? That's like turkey on Thanksgiving. You have to have that.
Right.
We're not going to put the liturgy in because God forbid a non-Jew would see the liturgy and see what that actually says. But we have to still sing Kol Nidre.
And I just want to say, it says Psalm 117, which is one of the shortest Psalms, 2 verses. And what is it? Hallelujah, Adonai, Kol Goyim Shalpuhu, Kol Ha'umim. Oh, praise the Lord, all you nations, praise him, all you people. Ki gavar aleinu chasdo ve'emet Adonai le'olam, hallelujah. For his loving kindness is great toward us, and the truth of the Lord endures forever. So that's the psalm that's it. And there's a great tune that you sing to it, right? That's like you sing it, and there it's put in, very universal, open the door for Elijah.
And how convenient, it's 2 verses. Like,
Right.
okay, it's great, that's fine.
Okay, so that's what's happening in the Reform world. And then 1943, what's happening in the world in 1943? Of course, right? So then there's an experimental leaflet, and I'm dying to get my hands on a copy of it. So as you go through the bowels of this building, if you find it, man, I would love to see it. I just would. the Reform Movement's rabbi organization, the CCAR, provided an experimental leaflet to be inserted in the Haggadah, a ceremonial for opening the door of Elijah. In response to a child's query, it provides a simplified explanation of the Reform idea of messianism. So Lindsay, will you be the child? And Bobby, will you be the reader? I'm on page 4.
Why does Elijah come?
He comes in answer to Israel's prayer. Again and again has our lot seemed utterly without hope. In this darkest night, our fathers were comforted by the hope of the coming of the Messiah. They believed that a better world would come from with him, a world in which Israel will live in dignity and in peace.
When will this better world come?
This is a mystery in the keeping of God, but when it comes, Elijah will be its herald. Before the messianic day comes, the spirit of Elijah must live in the hearts of men.
Has Elijah come? I don't see him.
He cannot be seen. He comes as the goodness that is in the hearts of men. He is justice. He is brotherhood. He is peace. As his spirit prevails more and more in the deeds of men and nations, does mankind come nearer to the messianic day.
Okay, so can I just stop for a second? That's a big deal, right? 1943, the CCR is the rabbis organization. And the rabbis are actually saying, people need something. Right? The Jewish world is being ripped apart. We got to address this in some way. They're not going to get a whole new Haggadah out, right? We know that. So there's a little pamphlet, which is a way to engage the child. And what's the message here? We don't know when the world is going to get better, but we have to hope. We can't stop hoping. Or believing, exactly right. And by the way, I don't know when it happens, but you know, in a lot of Haggadah, I mean, is sung, like, it's there as part of the, it's a song that's put in, but I believe, right, that same idea of hope. It's not, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. I believe that, I believe with perfect faith that the world is going to be repaired and whole.
I'm not gonna get into it, but that picture, and for folks who have the Xerox here in the room, it didn't come out great. I'm gonna enlarge the screen so you can appreciate it a little bit. I found this and I want to do some more digging on it. This is from the Benghazi Haggadah of 1943. I believe there were British troops who were in Libya and they connected with the Jewish community, whatever it was. It's an unbelievable Haggadah they put together. And that's the line, that's the section. You can see the big shin up there. That's the Shvo Hamatzcha. And you can see kind of the warplane and the bombing and all that's going on. It's just quite fascinating. And that's what, again, how it reflects. At the same time that the CCR is publishing here, this expression, here are these Jews and British troops who are in Libya at the time, fighting the war and just addressing. So that's just one little piece on art.
But you raise an interesting and I think really important point. That throughout this section that you're discussing is the context, the current context at the time of these particular writings, but the universality in essence and its applicability to today.
Well, and yes, I mean, that's why I started by telling you about Patty. And like, to me, like, this is our first Seder that we're planning together. So Mark and I both have to sit there and think about, like, what are those things are precious? And some of them are like, I have to make my farosa with pine nuts and apples and ginger and lemon juice, right? And that has to be there. But he's a good guy. He's willing to taste a new farosa recipe. It's not a big deal. But right, like, and there are certain pieces. Like, to me, I can't imagine not saying Shvo Hamatzcha at the Seder. I really can't, and I actually can't imagine. But at the same time, I'm married to a rabbi who's a pretty smart guy who thinks pretty carefully, critically about things. So we have to sit there and say, so are we going to include it or are we not? And if we do include it, I imagine we could include it in a way that it's clear we're not talking about the non-Jewish neighbor. It's clear we're not talking about the daughter-in-law of, the sister-in-law of my daughter to be, right? Like, it's clear we're talking, my daughter, she's my daughter,
You're doing right, you keep that.
It's clear we're talking, like, in that instance, it's clear we're talking not even about all Russians, right? We're talking
Right.
about an evil leader who is bringing, and that's different, and so I make those distinctions. I just want to say to your point about faith, if you go to the back on the very last page of my handout, in some Haggadah or another, I'm sure it's no one's page 9.
Page 9.
I don't want to read it, but I want you to just see Anne Frank's, I still believe
I
is
read
there.
that on my phone.
Right, okay. So that's what happened in the reform world. Is this really struggling with Shvol Hamakah? And then I'm gonna, I'm thinking for a second. So we should go up to 1974, which is probably the Haggadah that most of you know from the reform world. It's the Baskin Haggadah. And not only is Elijah printed, but he has his own section called Kos Eliyahu, the cup of Elijah, opened by 3 paragraphs of explanation, and it's followed by Psalm 79:7. They devoured Jacob and laid waste his habitation. The least offensive line of Shvol, and contextualized as reflecting a time when our doors were open to surveillance, when ignorant and hostile men forced our doors with terror. Meaning, what does the reform movement do in 1974? Holocaust also in 1974. I mean, if you think that this was being written in the 70s, like probably the committee or Gaskin started working on it in like the beginning of the 70s. I'm just gonna say the PLO, and there was all those bombings, and Israel was really under attack, for sure, the Holocaust, for sure. But it also puts it in the past tense. They, like, we're not gonna quote the verses that say, pour out your wrath. We're gonna quote the verse that said, they devoured Jacob. And it like we will remember, that moment, but we're not angry. We're just gonna remember that it happened.
Or justification, or, reiterating the reason why.
But I want to say in 1974, Shvol Hamakah isn't in the Haggadah. It gets in through the back door to say they did it. Elijah is there. Okay. You see that? All right. So let's skip the open door and we'll just go on to the reconstruction tool, which is the top of page 5. So
When did the doors open for the Russian Jews?
later, 90s.
90, 91.
Was that the?
There were some kind of, there was a trickle
In the late
in the
80s.
late 70s and in the 80s, but really it's 1990.
But we certainly knew that the Soviet Empire was evil in the 70s, right? We certainly knew that Jews were being oppressed, and more, if the truth is, in the 70s, we were finally beginning to talk about the Holocaust, right? It's no surprise that in the 50s and the 60s, like, the Holocaust didn't come into our theology. The world was numb from the pain of it. So by the 70s is when you begin to see, okay, this is something that we have to respond to. So the Reconstructionist Haggadah, Mordechai Kaplan, who the truth is, he is really like, I'm a Kaplanian Jew. I might have been ordained from the Jewish Theological Seminary, but I'm a Kaplanian Jew all the way. I just think he's brilliant. So and his Haggadah, which was published in 1941, which was burned, and Kaplan was actually excommunicated for the publication of his Haggadah. Why? Because the templates were not in there, because he couldn't believe in a God of that who would do those kinds of things. And in addition, he adds a section called the Cup of Elijah after Birkat Hamazon. And as the door is opened, the reader announces that Elijah is the herald of the Messiah, who will usher in an era when all people throughout the world will be free. A clear reflection of Kaplan's universalizing tendency, so central to the teaching of Kaplan. What I actually liked about Kaplan is that he had both a very strong universal teaching, but the story of his name tells you it all. When he was a little boy, he was Mendel. He was on his way to America, he stopped at France, and he was Maurice. For a short time, he was Max in America, and then he went to Mordechai. And so he was a Zionist through and through. He believed in the Jewish people. He was the intellectual behind the Jewish Community Center and the idea of a synagogue being more than just a place of prayer. And he really wrote about what is Judaism going to look like in the 20th century for America. But one piece is in it when it talked about like a Shvol Hamakah, he was thinking bigger than just the Jewish world, because he actually understood that Jews are not going to be at peace if the world isn't at peace. Right? It gets worse for Jews. Like And we could just see this with the whole, with all of Ukraine. How is it little bitty Israel is it like at the heart of this war? But it is actually, right? You're like, and so this is Kaplan's idea of this universal idea. Okay. The 2000, we could skip, you could read about what happens to the Haggadah and Reconstructionist movement in 2000. I want to go back to the Birnbaum Haggadah because this is a really important piece. The Birnbaum Haggadah was like the standard. When I was growing up, the Birnbaum Siddur was the term modern Orthodox didn't exist, but it was the Siddur of record for the Orthodox world. There was no art scroll. It was the Siddur of record. And the Haggadah, the Siddur, probably the text for the red and yellow comes from.
Even in South Africa.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. So while liberals were removing Shvoch, but recovering Elijah, and we saw that, right? Liberals meaning reform and reconstruction, Shvoch HaMakah, Elijah was traditional Haggadah, retained Shvoch HaMakah, but had not yet firmly included Elijah. Shvoch was a standard part of the liturgy, while opening the door for Elijah was still a folk custom. References to Elijah are therefore absent from Birnbaum's Haggadah in 1953 and 1976, while Shvoch appears with a faithful translation. Birnbaum wrote the following: this passage is recited while the door is kept open, so as to indicate that this is the night of vigils is protected against all harmful forces. The opening of the door also symbolizes the awaited appearance of Elijah as the forerunner of the Messiah. But there wasn't this section. Now, the reason I want to point this out is when you stop and think about it, when I asked how many of you opened the door for Elijah, y'all raised your hand. Y'all did.
Wow.
Good job.
Right?
I don't think that's something to be proud of, but okay.
So I turn to that and I say, it's a powerful piece. I'm really mindful of the clock, and I just want to say, in the true world of the true notion of the conservative world, we just struggle. So what Feast of Freedom, that's the Haggadah that I remember growing up with. It includes Shvoch with a translation and commentary which seeks to justify its presence. Right? That's what we consider. Like Reform Jews, you're strong and you just say, we don't like it, we'll take it out. Conservative Jews, we keep it and then we justify it. On behalf of those who cringe at Shvoch's vindictiveness, the Haggadah commentator asks, why does this impassioned innovation of divine wrath belong in our celebration of freedom? By the way, in the seventh, I just want to say, this was not the Haggadah my family was using at the time, it was the one before. This question comes in almost as if they anticipated my experience with Mr. Reader. He responds, because by opting conveniently for chronic amnesia, the world compels us to remember freedom's foes. Meaning, why do we have to keep Shvoch HaMakah in?
Because we gotta remember.
Right, it's a little bit of Amalek,
Yeah.
right? Like, you gotta remember. The commentary continues, while we are forbidden to hate the Egyptians, we are also enjoined to remember the crimes of the Amalekites.
Boy, that quote though, because by opting conveniently for chronic amnesia, the world compels us to remember freedom's foes. That is just.
It's a great
It's a
one.
That
great
is a
one.
great.
But the
line.
next one also, right? Like,
While we are forbidden to hate the Egyptians, we are also enjoined to remember the Christ. I mean,
that's it.
it's.
So now, like, I just give you 2 more minutes. So Patakowski says, what's with those conservative Jews, right? He didn't
He's
like
one
it.
of ours. He's
Yes, he is.
he's like the reform liturgy god of the kind of 1940s, 50s, right?
Can't the Haggadah simply tell us that at this point in the Seder, our poor persecuted ancestors used to give vent to their tired outcries? Fair enough. Okay, so here we are. That's the criticism.
And I want to just one thing about the art, because many of you have seen the Mas Haggadah, and then we said not that long ago, the Shvoch part. This, if you can see on the picture, that picture of the guy who's on the horse, on the mule, because this is Elijah. Mas plays with that exact image. That's one of the images that's in the Mas Haggadah. This I'm showing from 1560. Okay,
So
sorry.
at the
Now
beginning,
this is what I like.
This is like, read it, would you?
Sure. Pour out your love. Shvoch ahavatecha on the nations who have known you and on the kingdoms who call upon your name, for they show kindness to the seed of Jacob and they defend your people Israel from those who would devour them alive. May they live to see the sukkah of peace. spread over your chosen ones and to participate in the joy of all your nations.
So turn to page 9, because I want to give you the commentary. It is a very beautiful thing.
Page 9.
Pour out your love. Modern sensibilities have caused even more radical reactions to these verses. Israel Levy, a 19th century Jewish scholar living in Germany, taught that these verses were inappropriate in modern times, and he replaced them with verses that call for all nations to return to God. A similar sensibility seems to be behind what one could almost call a hoax. Wallk reported that he found an unusual version of this prayer in a manuscript Haggadah that had been compiled in 1521. I want to just pause. I have to tell you this story. I have a doctorate in education. When I was working on my doctorate, there was a gap because I had 3 children in the writing of that dissertation, and my dad died, so it took me, I'm the longest writing dissertation person in the world. So at one point, the chair of my committee is looking at my dissertation, and I quoted something that was written in 1985, let's say, and it's already 1995. And she says to me, your scholarship is dated, you need something a little newer. And I said, you don't get it. In the Jewish world, authentic scholarships, the more dead you are, the better the sources. Like if I just quote somebody who's alive and living in California, it's very shoddy scholarship. So that's what's happening here.
You
because
cannot
this is
question
exactly-
the dead.
What?
You cannot question the dead.
Right, but this is exactly what Wallk does. He says a manuscript of the compiled in 1521. He states that this manuscript, which included other poems that are not found in standard Haggadot in different versions of the text, it disappeared during the Holocaust without trace. Fortunately, he claims he retained some notes with this prayer. The text he cites is the one that Mark just read. Unlike the original prayer, which is a collection of biblical verses, this is a free composition, although replete with biblical allusions. Wallk has a reputation for presenting new texts as ancient documents, and it's very likely that this prayer is his own composition, expressing his own feelings in the wake of the Holocaust. He left Vienna and immigrated to the US in 1938 after he'd been arrested by Gestapo and freed with the help of an influential non-Jew. So I leave you with Shvok HaMakkah and Shvok HaHavachah, and you can appreciate, first of all, I just love the hoax idea, but it just no way in 1521 was somebody saying, pour out your love. That's just a very modern idea. I love the idea that he presents it as old, and we know that it's new. And to me, like, I want to wrestle with it, and I don't actually think it makes, to my mind, as long as in this particular time, and again, I'm back to Patty who says, well, what about, how is it that I go to services every day and we don't mention what's going on in Ukraine? It's a totally legitimate question. And I want to say the issue is the rabbis actually, in the putting together of the Siddur and in the Haggadah, had room for us to express our feelings. We who don't understand the text don't see it there. Right? It's not like Patty's not wrong to ask the question, and there's no reason that she should have known it given the education that she was given. It's on me to make sure that she sees those texts and understands there is a place for her to pour out her wrath, whether it is at the daily menu or whether it's at her sale. Thank
As we turn to remember those in our circle who have died in this past year and for whom we're marking your site on this Shabbat, first reading Kohelet wrote, in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, the eye never has its fill of seeing. The eye never has its fill of seeing. Young or old, those who depart this life never see enough of the world, never complete their task, never cherish their loved ones enough before they are called home. How they yearned for yet another respite from the final summons, and how we yearned to have them close to us for yet another challenge in our lives, yet another joy, yet another precious moment together. God be now with those whose hearts are broken because when parting comes, it comes too soon. Console them at this moment and always be near to them when light seems distant. Sustain them, O God, until the time of healing. Take a moment of silence to remember those who have died at the hands of terror and tragedy, indeed in places of Ukraine and beyond. Take a moment of quiet. We remember those in our circle who have died in this past year: Nancy Halewood, Don Bendick, Alfredo Pauca, Richard Lee Roberts, Marianne Cross, Judy Spiegel, Tom Loomis, David Friedman, Marion Pranikoff, Audrey Eisler, Bernice Pinsky, Paul Silverman, Marie Lamy, Gerald McKinney, Trudy Olson, Edith Trensky-Glock, Helen Schneider, Dorothy Engelhardt, Marge Sosnick, Mona Lieberman, Michael Pollack, Peggy Reed Rhodes. And those who are marking your site on this Shabbat: Daniel R. Backer, Gladys Slavin Brenner, David Brodkin, Emil Cohn, Gertie Mae Dilwith, Esther R. Eisenberg, Mo Fisher, Henny Heilbrunn, Richard Heilbrunn, Rose Koppelman, Reza Kremer, Leon Mizell, Esther Levin Ostrow, Marvin Rothner, Ida Spindell, Gloria Steinberger, Norman Willenzik. If there are any other names to add to our list on this day, please feel free to say.
Alex Moskowitz.
Ruth Greenberg.
Zichronam livracha, in the memory beat for a blessing. I will put the words of Kaddish Tom on the screen, and as you are able, I invite you to please rise. Just move this real quick, so it's larger for us here. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah, Be'alma Tibarach Yeruteh, Be'amich Malkuteh, B'chayechon, B'mechon, B'chayeh, B'chol Beit Yisrael, Ba'alad, Yisman, Karib, Yimru, Amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah, Be'orach, Le'olam, U'lomei, Almaya. Yitbarach, V'yishtabach, V'yisfahar, V'yitzromam, V'yiznaseh, V'yizhadar, V'yizhaleh, V'yizhalal, Shemei D'Kurisha, B'richu, Le'ela, Min Kol, Birchata, B'shirata, Dushbachata, V'nechemata, Ta'amiran, B'alma, V'yimru, Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chaim Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael, V'yimru, Amen. Osei Shalom B'Brama, U'yasei Shalom. Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael, V'yimru, Amen. May the one who makes peace in the high heavens above make peace for us, for all of Israel. Give me comfort to all who are bereaved, who can mourn during these days. And let us say, Amen. Take your seats. Now, Shimshon, you often have a Kiddush cup with you.
Chevron.
I have no Kiddush cup, but we have a Shamber, so we can sing a little bit
Ernest
Shamber.
Campbell.
And there's going to be, now listen, if anybody needs to leave, we understand. We have two things set. There's something you wanted to share, and I have a blessing for Eliezer and Shimshon as they are on their way. When do you fly?
Tuesday.
Tuesday to Eretz Israel. Adonai, get you home, we're golfing, you'll be good to go. Let me give you the setup. Let me stop the share. All right, Seth, is there something you wanted to share? And then I'm gonna do a priestly benediction for Lindsay and for Shimshon on their trip, and that way we can all say Keni Hiratzon together, and then we'll close up our time. So, Zach.
You both are in a liminal space that is following and preceding a new beginning. And it occurs to me that during Simchat Torah, the liminal space is very brief. You end and you begin again. There's no delay in it. And I have something that I want to present to both of you, which I was going to present to you, Rabbi Mark, in May before you left here, but I didn't know that you, Rabbi, were going to be here, and this was a perfect opportunity, so thank you for a couple of minutes. And it's a piece of artwork that I made a while back from pictures I took during Simchat Torah. And the piece is called Beginnings. And there's a description on the back, which I need to date. Rabbi Mark and Rabbi Amy, wishing you both a wealth of wonderful beginnings as you walk your paths together, and many blessings too.
Thank you.
Here is beginnings.
Oh my gosh.
And this over here
Wow.
is Brishit Bara Hello.
Hello. Wow. Oh my gosh. That is insane. That is incredible.
Gorgeous.
Wow.
May you have many, many years.
Oh, thank you so much.
So much.
So much.
For those of you who do not know Seth's work, Seth does this incredible, you could describe it way better than I could. He takes pictures. You're an outstanding photographer on your own right. And then he does stuff on the computer with it that is just beyond. I have a bird in my office from our trip to Israel. We had visited Beit Guvrin, which are these unbelievable caves. And there's a bird that was there. And this is, that is
And this
just.
has, you'll put the odd here, here's the roller over there. These little squiggles are from the breastplate, from the design of the breastplate. Here's the odd again, and this over here is Mike Backfield's thumb. Right over there, holding this guy. And
Mike, I got a piece of you in here. Too bad it's not the beard.
and I did black on white, black on black.
That is.
Thank you so much.
That's beautiful. What, these two artists? We're framed by our, no fun. By our hard work that we're leaving. That's great. And a photography also down at the end of the table. The wall, okay. So let's do this. Let's put Eliezer and Shimshon, Amy and Naomi, I'm just gonna ask you to kind of part the waters here. Let's all stand up together. You two stand right here. Oh my goodness, it was such a blessing to stand with you at Torah last night and to conclude this moment and celebrate on the Shabbat of your getting ready to journey to Israel, that it should have been one of great blessing. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. You can all say Keni Ratzon. Keni Ratzon. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you safe along the way. May God's light illuminate for you graciousness and compassion and joy, treasures within our land and within your souls, within our people's collective experiences. May God's presence ever be with you along the way, and may you find and create moments of great enduring peace for those around you, for yourselves, and let us all say, Amen. Nasiya Tova, that's what we're saying. Nasiya Tova. It should be a wonderful, wonderful trip. We expect pictures. by the way, through the various people in your lives who can. Great. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Just by way to remember, next week, we're on for Moadon again on whatever that is, the next two Shabbatot, then we're off because it's the first day of Pesach. And then we start movies with a side of Torah with Renata Jackson. And we're having a special Shabbat. Naomi's doing some artwork during that time also. So we have great, there's a flyer. If we didn't put it in this past Wednesday, it's going to come out very shortly of what to look forward to. The first one up, just so you know, it's not too soon to watch it. You can watch it for free on PBS. To Kill a Mockingbird, the 1962 version. To Kill a Mockingbird, that's going to be our first film. That's going to be on April 23rd. Just be aware. And the rest to come. All right. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. You can unmute if you want to say. We'll see you.
Thank you, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy.
Shabbat Shalom, this was fascinating.
I saw
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Janie. Thank you, Ellen. It's Donna. Good to see you. All right. Good job, Ed. I'll watch the.
Really good.